Welcome back, I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series, where we use our AI, Design Eye, to analyse an old competition piece of mine and give us some insight into the principles and elements of design and how this design might be improved. This week we're looking at a title that is quite commonly used in competitions, and the title is Using Three Flowers. Now sometimes it's one flower, sometimes it's two, but mostly it's using three flowers, and this can be quite a challenge given the space that is allowed, because it really does indicate that we should have three flowers that are featured. You can certainly use other flowers, but the three featured flowers should be the focal point of the design. So here I've used an old timber fence post from a farm. This is an agricultural show, so I like to use items that appeal to the viewing public, shall we say. So this fence post has a turned top on it, so it has a very small opening at the top that can be used for dried flowers. It's not the opening doesn't obviously go all the way through the fence post, and you'll see on the website many other times that I've used this particular piece of wood. I love it, and it's long lasting and it lends itself to a whole lot of things. So here I've used that as the structure. On the top of it I've made a little resting place, I guess, out of some woven material, so that the protea flower can sit on top of that inside a vial, because they do need a little bit of water for this particular show. And I've got a second protea flower placed at the bottom with some woolly bush at the back to join the bottom part of the design to the top of the design. My three flowers, going against tradition, which if you know my designs you'll know that this is what I do. My three flowers are agapanthus flower heads with the flowers removed, with the actual flower part removed. This still, what's there still forms part of the flower. It's a flower head, and so my feeling was that this still met the criteria for the design. They are a feature, they are where your eye is drawn to first of all in this design. The design actually placed first, but I'm interested to see what Design Eye has got to say for us, because in looking at it now, it's probably 7-8 years ago that I did this design. I can see some things that need adjustment, need help, but let us now look at what Design Eye's got to say and the suggestions at the end of it. Working with line, first of all, the vertical line of the agapanthus flower creates a sense of height and movement, drawing the eye upward. The diagonal lines formed by the placement of the other two flowers and foliage provide visual direction and balance, connecting the base to the top of the design. So as I mentioned earlier, I wanted something that would connect the base to the design. I was hoping that the foliage and the protea flowers would do that. It's interesting that it sees it as diagonal lines. I had hoped that it was all going to be straight up, but you're dependent on how straight the floral material is for that to actually work. So let's look at shape and form now. The cylindrical shape of the wooden base contrasts with the radial forms of the flowers and foliage, creating visual interest. The flowers themselves offer natural sculptural forms that add character and dimension to the arrangement. And that's very much what I had hoped. The protea flower is very sculptural by its nature. Taking off the spent flower tips from the agapanthus flower head has given it a much more interesting, visually interesting and sculptural element. And of course the base, the timber, is very sculptural by its nature. Texture now. The weathered rough texture of the wooden base contrasts beautifully with the soft smooth texture of the protea petals and the feathery greenery, that's the woolly bush at the back. This combination of textures enhances the tactile appeal of the design and emphasises the natural elements. It certainly does look natural. I guess my concern is that there's a whole lot of rough textures, and I don't necessarily see the protea petals as smooth. They're smoothed in the placement of them, but I would like to see perhaps something shiny in the design, in the foliage side of things. So perhaps Gymea leaf, something that's bold still and a nice dark green, but something that could be a bit more obviously shiny and smooth than what I've got in there now. Colour. The muted tones of the wooden base and green foliage are harmoniously balanced by the dusty pinks of the protea blooms, creating a cohesive and organic palette. The green of the foliage and agapanthus elements add freshness and a sense of life to the arrangement. Well, that's good. That's a good balance of colour and impression that it's giving you. Once again, had there been the bold, shiny leaf there, I think that it would have diminished the dominance of the timber and actually added to the overall harmonious balance of the colours within the design. A nice dark green to go with the dark brown of the base. Space now. The design incorporates both positive and negative space effectively. The open area around the top flower creates a sense of airiness and prevents the design from feeling crowded. However, the lower area could benefit from more negative space to avoid visual heaviness around the base. That's very true. That's probably the first thing that I noticed when I looked at the design after all these years. And I can think of some ways that might improve that. But let's just wait till we get to the end of the analysis and see what the suggestions are. Balance. The design achieves asymmetrical balance with the taller agapanthus flower providing vertical weight and the lower protea blooms anchoring the composition. The visual weight of the wooden base is well balanced by the airy placement of the flowers and foliage. Now this is where I disagree with this analysis, because I think that the visual weight of the base remains almost too dominant, and it could almost be the focal point of the design, except that the height and the line of the agapanthus flowers distracts your eye somewhat from that base. So I would certainly look at some improvement to the way the base is used in this design to take away from that, what I perceive as the visual weight of the wooden base, different to the analysis, the independent analysis, shall we say. Let's now look at proportion. The height of the design is well proportioned to the size of the wooden base, creating a harmonious relationship between the elements. The protea blooms appear slightly large relative to the agapanthus flowers, which could disrupt the proportional harmony. And I think that's very true. I think that what it's lacking is some transitional material, some smaller material between the size of the protea and the size of the agapanthus. Even though they're large, the agapanthus, they're not as visually heavy as the protea, and so the proportions are probably a little bit out when I look at it, and so it just one of those things where it just doesn't look quite right, but you can't work out what it is. I think it's the proportions, personally. So rhythm now. The repetition of the green foliage and the similar radial forms of the flowers creates rhythm, guiding the viewer's eye through the design. The placement of the elements encourages a natural flow from the base upward. And that's very much what I wanted. And I think getting the proportions right would enhance that rhythm as well. So you fix one thing, it often will have a flow-on effect, positive effect, with a lot of the other elements or principles of design. Emphasis now. The upper agapanthus flower acts as a focal point due to its height and placement. The protea blooms provide secondary focal points that draw attention to the base. The emphasis could be improved by slightly refining the placement of the protea blooms to avoid competing with the taller flower. So this is what I mentioned just before, in that if we had looked at the proportions a little bit better, then that top protea flower wouldn't be competing, and it shouldn't actually, now that I look at it, even in talking to you, it shouldn't be at the same level as the middle agapanthus flower. There should always be some positioning so that there is interest everywhere, not you, because what you run the risk of is if you've got flowers on the same level, is that's where your eye stops. What the saving grace is in this design is that top agapanthus flower is so much taller, and it does follow the line of the timber base, that your eye is drawn away from that stopping point of those two placements that are too much of the same height. Harmony and unity now. The use of natural materials and a cohesive colour palette creates a sense of harmony and unity in the design. The wooden base effectively grounds the design, unifying the elements with its earthy texture and colour. So I'm glad it looks harmonious. I do think that a darker green in it would, and as I mentioned earlier, the shiny, smooth surface would actually help with the harmony and the unity and bring the elements together that are there. I just feel like there's a bit too much rough happening for my liking in this design. So let's see what the suggestions are now for improving this design. First of all, refining the flower placement, which we have talked about. Slightly adjust the positioning of the protea blooms to create a clearer visual pathway and reduce competition with the agapanthus flower. So that's exactly what I have been talking about, and I will definitely do that when I did it again. What I'd probably do is put that top the top protea flower through the hole that is usually for wire in the timber base, the top hole, and that would bring it to a different level. It would bring the base into the design a little bit more as well. Enhance proportions. Introduce a smaller or more delicate element near the protea blooms to balance their size relative to the tall agapanthus, maintaining proportional harmony. So it's reassuring for me that I can look at these designs and I know what I should do to improve them, but once again, it's important for us as a learning tool to have this independent analysis, even if it's just reinforcing what we think, but it's an independent analysis looking at it just in terms of the principles and elements of design, nothing else in its head, and saying this is a suggestion for improvement. Increase the negative space. Create more open space around the lower area by reducing the density of the foliage, allowing the base and flowers to stand out more distinctly. And that's quite true, I think, that I just collected it all there together at the base. I've got a feeling it might be hiding some of the mechanics, but I don't remember well enough to know if that's the case. But it does need to be opened up a little bit more around that base area. Base and flower connection. Consider adding a small transitional element, fine grasses or moss, at the base to soften the connection between the protea blooms and the wooden cylinder, enhancing unity. So that's what I mentioned earlier about putting that protea into the fence post, into the timber, to bring the design, bring that timber into the design. At the moment, it's an element that stands on its own, and yes, I use the top of it, but it's not really, to my mind, part of the design. And so the other thing I could have done is wrapped around that parallel placement and wrapped it around the fence post a little bit more. So some good suggestions there for improvements. With this particular design. That's the analysis from Design Eye of using 3 flowers for this particular competition. If you'd like your own designs analysed so that you can explore alternatives for designs that you might have created, or you just want some general feedback on a design that you've done, all you need to do is submit the image to the website, and within about 24 hours you'll have back an analysis. They are all looked at, I can reassure you, by human judges before they go out, just to make sure that it's going to make sense and be useful to you. That's it for this week. Join us again for another design dissection. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Online.